So I am going to take the perspective of contrasting what diversity is on the table, biodiversity on the table. We live in a country that may not be as biodiverse as countries with ecosystems, well, at least in mainland France, as countries with tropical forests or coral ecosystems. We still have quite a few species. We have some 600 species of birds, 200 species of mammals. When we go into the invisible, when we go into the soil, for example, the INRA in Dijon has created a very beautiful atlas showing that when we make 2,200 holes in France, we find more than 120,000 species of bacteria. And if we make a 2,001st point, we will still find other species of bacteria. So we do have indeed a great biodiversity because we have lots and lots of species. Well, no, that's not it at all. To show you how nonsensical the previous statement is, I brought you a car. This is a car. Now, everyone understands that this is not a car. It's a piece of a car. Well, what I just described is a piece of biodiversity, but it's not biodiversity at all. Just as that is only a part of the car, what I just described is only a part of biodiversity, it's the one we immediately think of. Because if you type biodiversity on the internet, you will see catalogs of species, environments where there are plenty of species. But in reality, that's only part of the story. And it's important to understand that biodiversity also exists above the species level and below. That is to say, what is part of biodiversity within the species? Genetic diversity, that is to say, the diversity of individuals who carry genes that are similar but not identical in every way. Look at your neighbor, you'll see they are not like you. Because they have particular genes, because they have different genes. So that is a part of diversity. And this part of diversity, we tend to forget, is diversity, intraspecific, is genetic diversity. And you notice one thing, it's that every time there are fewer individuals in a species, there can necessarily be less of this genetic diversity. And here we realize that what also matters is the size of the populations, because only very large populations can contain a very large number of different genes. If we take 3 people here and recreate a population with them, we won't have the same genetic diversity as we had in this room. And that means that the number of individuals matters in diversity. And also that there is diversity within the species. But that's not all. There is also diversity in terms of species assembly. In an ecosystem, you have several species that coexist and establish connections among themselves, such as parasitism, mutual aid, and competition. And so, in fact, in diversity, there is also the diversity of species assemblages, the diversity of ecosystems, the diversity of interactions between species. Just as a diversity of interactions of the parts of a car, which are also a part of the car. I mean, the wheels have a fairly obvious connection to the engine. That is part of the car. Well, the connections between species are part of biodiversity. So you see, biodiversity is more than just a catalogue of species. It's the diversity within these species and the diversity of how these species interconnect with each other. So, the efficiency of agriculture, and you were right to say that conventional agriculture, so let's say it has an efficiency. And the way we all benefit from it, as you say, is when we all eat to our fill, in quantity, which has not always been the case in human history, and it is still not the case for all of humanity. So that agriculture, it has quantitatively fulfilled its contract. It fulfills it with short-term efficiency precisely by denying biodiversity. And not so much by denying species biodiversity, because on our plates there are plenty of species. Still, it must be said, no, by linking diversity within species, that is, by creating lineages that work very well in the short term, but ultimately make us lose the biological diversity of the species and the gene reserves that could serve us tomorrow. So, in a way, this agriculture has denied the fraction of biodiversity, that is intraspecific. And then, by creating monospecific fields, that is, with a single target species and weeding out everything else, it has denied the diversity of species assembly. You see that ultimately the problem of agriculture and biodiversity is perhaps less the problem of species diversity than the problem of intraspecific diversity, genetic diversity, which peasant seeds, for example, aim to promote a bit more, with a logic whose sustainability can be debated. Also, but which is still more responsible in terms of raising awareness of this diversity, and then also a diversity in the assembly of species that we need to rediscover. Because in fact, when we look at the long term, we realize that ecosystems are not made to They have never functioned with just one species. So there are lots of functions that start to go haywire when we have only one species in a field. And so we need, today as well, to reintroduce the diversity of assembly. And this program is implemented in many ways. Agroforestry, for example, is a way to introduce more species into a field, having mixed crops. Mixtures, for example, cereals and legumes, is also a way to rediscover the path of assembly. And then to conclude, of course, there is all the temporal diversity, which involves having crops, intercrops that do not leave the soil bare between two crops. Objectives, in short, this diversity of spatial and temporal assembly, this complexity of population with multiple interacting species, that is to say, the super-specific level of biodiversity also needs to be rediscovered. And so, truly, biodiversity is something that unfolds within the species, in the number of species, and in the relationships between species. And it's all these, that's it. Biodiversity scales that we need to remobilize in agriculture. I'll just give you an example. You know, lily. Grasses have ways to fight against plants that compete with them by emitting tannins, quite specific tannins, hydroxynamic acids into the soil. It's quite effective. They weed around themselves. And this logic they have in relation to other plants was completely forgotten in domestication, because artificially we remove the weeds, so we no longer select our plants to clear the area around their roots. So we just lost a tool, which was a tool for interspecific relationships, and that we lost. In domestication, because we lost in domestication the intraspecific diversity, and there you see the link between intraspecific diversity and the diversity of interspecific relationships. In fact, we have enormous levers to take back control of, and levers that will undoubtedly ensure stronger sustainability for our agricultural ecosystems by taking back control of the different scales of biodiversity,